Max is director of the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance. Let's welcome Max Stephenson.
Well, maybe obviously I want to talk a little bit about the leadership role that arts and artists can play in community. It'll be a little bit different theme perhaps than we've had heretofore during the day, but I hope that it will be obvious that the two are in fact related. One of the questions I want to address very briefly is, can artists be community leaders? And suggest to you that they can be, and that they can help us think in different ways about the challenges that we share, the kinds of problems that we are confronting. And here are some examples. What are the issues that the arts can help us address? Maybe we can clarify at least some of those concerns as we speak here. Can the arts be both an economic stimulus for us, provide economic benefits as we've heard today, but also, and as importantly I want to suggest, help us secure cultural and community development? I guess I want to argue most basically that communities can enjoy the benefits of the arts, the economic benefits of the arts, but also they can profit from the power of the arts in community to help us chart new paths collectively. What about leadership and the arts, or leadership and leaders? Leaders help us make sense of our world. We look to leaders to satisfy a very basic human need, which is help me understand what it is I'm confronting as all of this stuff comes in at me. They help us, and we ask them to help us, sort through the jumble of events, signals, and perceptions that typify our daily lives. They help us to imagine, in short, how to assign meaning to what it is we're experiencing. And in doing so, sometimes they validate us. Sometimes they may ask us to think differently than we otherwise might. And the tension implicit between our hearing that which we wish to hear, that which might secure the kind of positive change we might otherwise wish to have, but are perhaps unprepared to undertake or find difficult to address, is critical both to the possibility and to the character of community leadership. Here are examples of leaders. Now, what about the role of artists as leaders? There are some famous ones here that became political leaders. A few you might recognize. Artists can play this leadership role. In what sense? Well, as they create, as they imagine, I want to argue that they help us see the paths ahead. They imagine new ways of thinking. They chart new possibilities. They see more clearly. They see more clearly than perhaps we do what it is we are experiencing. They see things which do not now, or at least in our view, as we're looking at the world, yet exist. And they imagine that possibility even before we're able to do so. We look to them not only to help us make sense of the world, but to imagine that step into the darkness that we heard Monica speak of this morning, which is fundamentally a question of imagination. So putting it a little bit differently, artists, I want to suggest, exercise the sort of imagination that we demand of leaders every day. And in fact, they're quintessentially organized to see in ways that otherwise many of us would not be able to see beyond. They see on the canvas before them a narrative. They see a landscape. They have opportunities as they imagine these possibilities to move us, to discover narratives that make sense of our world, to touch us in ways that we otherwise might ourselves not address. And in that process, and very much as leaders are supposed to do when we think about it, they help us reflect more deeply on who we are and what we believe. And artists and community can play that role for us. They can help us create meaning, and as they help us create meaning in those acts of imagining, they can yield new paths and new potentials for us. But one of the troubling things that we've discovered, and we've interviewed people across this region, for example, who are artists, some 70 different interviews across the region, and I don't believe it's unique to Southside or to this community, is that it's not always recognized. This role for artistry, for imagination, for artists, often goes unremarked in the community. And I'm not sure, frankly, that I can tell you why it's often so under-remarked. But here's a quick anecdote. We assign to these people that stuff that's creative, and we go, artists do that stuff. And we don't imagine that they can play broader leadership roles in community. We don't imagine that the arts can play a leadership role in community. We go, and this is a true story, we have an artist on a community planning team. What do we ask that artist to do? Please design us trash cans for our public space. Don't help us think imaginatively about our public problems. Don't help us think more broadly about our community needs. Please design us trash cans. And that may be part of the issue, that we simply don't recognize the power of imagination that's in our midst and for what it might mean for our understanding of leadership. So again, artists lead as they imagine, as they create meaning. I think this collective sensibility problem is important in the sense that it can take us time to understand the ways in which the artists and arts can open up possibilities to rethink assumptions, values, and perhaps even prejudices. One of the things that as human beings we have trouble doing sometimes is imagining how it could be different than it now is, or why what I believe currently isn't in fact perfect. And so the question arises is when we challenge assumptions, it can often be a difficult question in community, whether we're challenging them individual to individual, or whether, as Ted has suggested this morning, broader global events cataclysmically are challenging how we understood our community. So what role can artists play as they help us rethink assumptions, help us test values, help us imagine and illuminate potentials is really what I want you to be thinking about. And I want to argue that artists, particularly artists, are uniquely situated and positioned to play that role of illuminating those potentials, helping us test assumptions and values, helping us see new possibilities. How can their efforts help us in our communities? Well, obviously, we spent a lot of time this morning, Ted and others, discussing the ways in which, and I think they're profound, that the arts can play a role as an economic engine in our region and more broadly, and it's I think it's a very large role indeed. The arts and design can surely generate economic opportunity. But I want to focus here just for a minute on this generative possibility for community, which I think is also innate in art, innate in the artistic imagination. And I want to suggest to you that the role they play in leading us to new possibilities is in fact a central possible role for arts, and a role that the arts can play that turns on leadership in our communities. They can and will and often do stimulate individual and community reflection. They can ask questions that are profound, like who are we? Who are we as South Boston? Who are we as Halifax County? Who are we? What do we wish to become? And they can do that in a way that helps us plumb the depths of our own understanding, just as Shakespeare plumbed the human psyche deeply in Lear and Hamlet, but he raised searching questions at the same time about what it meant to live in family, what it meant to live in community, that remain vital for us today. And that's just but one example, and perhaps a small one. The arts and artists can help us help lead us to new insights about who we are and what it means to be those things in community, especially as we recognize that change will happen, whether or not we like what we're undergoing, and however devoutly we might wish, that it would remain the same. To enable the arts to play this role and touch us deeply, allow these kinds of thinking to emerge, is really to touch our aesthetic imagination, to exercise aesthetic imagination. Sometimes that occurs dramatically. I think even in the intro here, Ted suggests sometimes that occurs over time. We need time to confront the questions that are being presented to us. But when it happens, it opens new ways of thinking, and I think that's key to the possibilities of our communities considering fresh assumptions. Another way I think to put this is to say that the arts and the artistic or aesthetic imagination can help us distinguish between what have been labeled technical and adaptive problems. And this becomes an important distinction for people working in community. Most of our important community challenges today, I think we've heard all day today, are adaptive in character, especially how to respond to the implications of a globalizing economy for this region. Let me just give you a quick overview. Technical problems, these are technical if we already know how to respond to them. Like my car engine breaks, what's wrong with it? I need a new water pump. If there exist procedures for what to do and role authorizations for who should do it. Challenges are adaptive, and I want to argue most challenges in our community are adaptive in character and certainly in a globalizing world. If a particular problem can't be addressed by the application of current technical know-how or routine behavior, we can't do more of the same and recreate this economy. We can't do more of the same and test and challenge and develop a new value set for our communities. Technical solutions offer a simple, direct, prescriptive answer. I can fix your water pump, Dr. Stephenson, it's going to cost this much money. That they offer protection and order, but they don't require change. Nobody asked me to change anything, they just put a new water pump in the same car. But as I reflect on what's happening in these communities, you're being asked to think about some very fundamental values and questions that do require change. Artists, I think, are uniquely positioned to help you do that. And they're uniquely positioned to help you engage in adaptive work. That requires collective and individual learning, and it requires redressing conflicts. Not everybody's going to agree on what to do, how to do it, or even whether we ought to change. It was always good. I enjoyed growing up here in Southside in my particular community. Why do we have to change? It requires then navigating those values, beliefs, and changing behavior. Here are popular examples. You may have read The 1 Minute Manager, which is really a bunch of technical fixes for would-be managers. Here in 1 minute are what you need to know to run an efficient, effective organization. Another bestseller was an adaptive problem and an adaptive prescription, which is what happens in fundamental change. And you may recall in that short text, what happens is one mouse decides that he will sit and for sure be sure that change isn't necessary. Somehow cheese will become available. Cheese does not become available, and that mouse does not fare well. Another mouse, same story, decides he has to find new places to find cheese, and he does very well indeed. Authoritative versus technical and adaptive leaders. And I want to argue, of course, that artists are profoundly adaptive, imaginative people. Authoritative and technical leaders will step in, they'll tell us what we need to do. MacGyver's getting old now, right? But MacGyver was a guy who could use a bobby pin to fix anything on television. How to solve, they'll tell you how to solve prescriptively your problem. They'll provide direction, they'll provide protection and order. And note what I said earlier about leadership. What do we look to leaders to do? Make sense of the world, help me understand. Don't challenge me if at all possible, because that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable. So a technical leadership is a very kind of Alluring notion. Come in, General MacArthur, and tell me. Come in, MacGyver, and fix the problem with your bobby pin. So to be successful, they don't have to address hard questions. Instead, they tell us, here's your prescription, here's my 1 minute manager prescription for your problem. Adaptive leaders, on the other hand, here are two examples, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, create and manage very difficult, this is a fancy psychological term, it just means opportunities that allow people reflective time to deal with their own conflicts, to test their own values, to think about their own assumptions, and to test those. They offer those opportunities for holding environments to allow people to reflect actively on what it is they think and what it is they believe. Getting on the balcony means the leader has patience, offers those opportunities as long as is necessary for the community to grapple with its own challenges, rather than to expect that they can prescribe an answer for anything so complex as what it is you confront in this region. They think politically, they use conflict, they don't fear conflict, they allow people to talk about their differences and manage that successfully. They have to manage their own hunger, by which I mean simply most leaders are driven people. They want action, they want results just as much as you and I do, and they have to anchor themselves in the kind of forbearance and patience that both King and Gandhi exemplified. And in this process, I want to argue that these folks, that is artists, can particularly serve this role of adaptive leadership in community. When they do so, their efforts can allow community members to reflect again on their most basic, and here's the important point, often unconscious assumptions. At this level, a lot of us never think about what it is we believe. We're not asked to do that. But if the economy asks that we do that, If social change demands that we do that, we can rail against that possibility, act defensively, refuse to confront the possibility of change, or we can engage collectively and individually in adaptive work. And I just want to suggest that artists, whether through theater or sculpture or street festivals or all sorts of painting or whatever, those formats can ask us to think about those problems. Let me just give you one quick example. For 5 years, Americans for the Arts in Concert with the Ford Foundation ran a program called Animating Democracy. Hundreds of projects across the United States. A couple of them come to mind. One I'll bring real quickly to the fore. Steelbound, it was called. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Remember Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? Bethlehem Steel? Doesn't exist anymore. So you had, along the river, you had acres, as we were having described today in North Adams, acres of what had been world-class steelmaking facility empty, overnight virtually. A community asked to recreate itself, imagine a new identity for itself. It had always been a steel town. It had always been Bethlehem Steel's town. Everyone could work in that steel mill. It was gigantic, and it was the city. Now, what do we do when Bethlehem goes away? Part of the answer was to ask the arts to help us think about those things, to have theater, as Chris would produce here. And in this case, an interesting production in the steel mill itself, all community residents participating, not professionals. And they created a play called Prometheus Unbound. How about that? And they involved hundreds and hundreds of citizens in that play. And of course, everyone came out to see it besides. And it was one cathartic moment among many that artists helped to generate in that community as it confronted the changing conditions there. Many of you know the Lehigh Valley, thank you very much, is doing very well against a whole new set of aspirations. The important part of the artist's role there, did they do everything? No. Government played a role, all these actors played a role, as was pointed out this morning. The important part to point out is that the arts helped, and those artists in that community helped. That community to imagine afresh new possibilities, to think again about those latent assumptions, to imagine with some hope there were possibilities for the future they had not considered. They did, in short, help the people in the Lehigh Valley, and particularly in Bethlehem, imagine themselves in new ways. A very important role. And I think that may be the most important role, not to say anything about the direct economic benefits that artists can bring to a community. I don't want to argue that that's a bad thing at all, but I do want to suggest maybe that's the most important role for the arts and community, this ability to prompt us to imagine ourselves in new ways, to elicit fresh conversations, to have us thinking in different ways about what it is we believe, why we believe it, and whether, in fact, it ought to change. Artists and artisans provide us opportunities for illumination and reflection. They can throw fresh light, elicit fresh civic dialogue, a broader dialogue amongst members in our communities than we otherwise might have obtained. How do we position ourselves, or better maybe reposition? And I don't just mean in economic terms. I mean our collective understanding of who we are in this community. What does it mean to be from this community, to address our collective changes? What is our relationship? This is important to this community. Hear me. What is our relationship to the land? What are our relationship to other communities in our region? They can ask us to reflect deeply, can bring those questions to us in a wide variety of ways, too, on our basic relationships with our other citizens, those who live with us in community. How is it we understand race? How should we understand race? How is it we understand social class? What role do we assign education? Those are all fair game for the artist to raise as questions for civic dialogue in community. Let me be clear. I don't want to say that this is the only role the arts can play. I don't want to argue that the leadership role, for this kind of leadership role for the arts, should gainsay anything that's been said about the terribly important direct economic contribution the arts can and do provide our communities. I simply want to suggest instead that the arts can help us debate, define our social assumptions, and help us confront the new future that we are facing. But they're a part, they're not the only part of the answer that we must turn to in order to be able to address those questions. Again, they can lead us to new insights about our values, they can lead us to new possibilities as we think about our potential. And I think we shouldn't pass up that opportunity. we ought to be looking for ways to elicit those possibilities, and that role for arts in our community. Thank you.